It's the summer of 2008. Iron Man just dropped, a film that not only revitalized Robert Downey Jr.'s career, but also kickstarted a billion-dollar franchise. Just 2 months later, The Dark Knight also dropped, solidifying Christopher Nolan's legendary status as a filmmaker and giving us one of the greatest acting performances of all time. These two films marked the beginning of a superhero craze that would last for more than a decade. Yet, fast forward to 2024, and much of this infatuation has fizzled out, despite some questionable attempts to keep these stories relevant. Superhero media has been on the decline for years, with most new iterations feeling dull and predictable. That is, with the exception of 2 TV shows that have managed to set themselves apart from the rest. The Boys and Invincible each serve as a response to the superhero madness that began back in 2008. These shows effectively deconstruct the comic book genre, exposing the often neglected underbelly of these clean-cut heroes we look up to. Now, I'm not claiming that either show is entirely revolutionary. They're both graphic novel adaptations, so the stories aren't exactly new per se. And they've also been preceded by a handful of similar adaptations like Watchmen and Kick-Ass. That being said, Zack Snyder's Watchmen was released in 2009, and Matthew Vaughn's Kick-Ass was released in 2010, both right around the beginning of the superhero craze. While these two films are solid and certified classics in my book, neither of them ever made as much of an impact on mainstream media as The Boys and Invincible have. And I mean, this shouldn't really be a huge surprise considering the fact that the first season of The Boys came out in 2019, and the first season of Invincible came out in 2021. This allowed superheroes to reach their peak concentration in media, while also giving the show writers time to effectively adapt these stories in ways that feel more relevant. There are 4 core elements within The Boys and Invincible that I feel help differentiate them from many of the other superhero stories out there today. Those elements are violence, satire, vulgarity, and humanity. In this video, I'll briefly break down each element and how they've all had an influence on the popularity of these two shows. With that in mind, I will be touching on minor spoilers from seasons 1 through 4 of The Boys, as well as seasons 1 and 2 of Invincible. If you haven't watched either of these shows yet, I strongly recommend doing so. They're both pretty great. You can always add this video to your watch later list and get back to it at some point within the next century. Now, watch as I attempt to break down 2 of the most graphic and violent shows on TV without violating the community guidelines. Well, let's see how this goes. If you've watched a single episode of The Boys or Invincible, you know that they do not shy away from graphic violence. They're actually kind of known for it. This device is strategically used in each show to establish the tone while also reinforcing the core themes. Despite being a little unpleasant at times, violence serves a purpose greater than simple shock value. And there's really no better way to sum this up than by taking a look at the pilot episode of each series.
I can't stop, 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 I can't stop. Robin?
Within the first 5 minutes of The Boys, we're introduced to Homelander and Queen Maeve, who save the day in classic heroic fashion. We are then introduced to Huey and his girlfriend Robin, who gets pureed right in front of his eyes mere seconds later. This opening sequence wastes no time presenting us with a dichotomy between the way heroes are depicted in the media versus real life. This is not the world these characters are living in. This is.
Robin!
And these are just the first few minutes in a series that's had 4 seasons to give us the most horrific and f***ed up scenarios imaginable. Sure, the violence may be a bit over the top at times, but it continually reminds the audience that these characters aren't living in a fairy tale.
Oh God, oh God!
No. No God. The only man in the sky is me.
The same is true for Invincible. While The Boys establishes its tone within the first few minutes of the pilot, Invincible does the exact opposite. To unsuspecting viewers, the entire first episode plays out feeling like any other run-of-the-mill superhero story. That is, until the last few minutes, when the heroes we were introduced to at the beginning of the episode are systematically murdered by Omniman. As soon as the killing begins, the triumphant music cuts out, leaving nothing but the haunting sounds of these helpless heroes trying to fend off a man who outmatches them in every regard. We get hints at Omniman's power throughout the episode, but this is the scene that puts them on full display. This brutal series of events serves as a harsh reality check for the viewer. While the story might have felt like a typical superhero parody, make no mistake, it's much more complex than that. When you live in a world with superpowered beings like Homelander and Omniman, it's pretty much a guarantee that everyday people will be treated like insects. and this is something that's often brushed over in other mainstream comic book universes. Captain America Civil War is a great example. In this film, you have a character as powerful as Vision going up against just a regular dude in Hawkeye, yet he walks away completely unharmed. The only person to get seriously injured in this battle is Rhodey, yet that issue gets resolved before the film even ends. To be fair, I don't think the goal for this film was to kill off half of the cast. That happens in Infinity War. Yet, those consequences don't last very long either, with almost everyone coming back in the next film. The Boys and Invincible simply aren't shackled by the same restrictions as the MCU. You can point to tons of different examples of how violence pushes these two narratives forward. In The Boys, it showcases the carelessness of these heroes and the cruelty of the world they're living in. In Invincible, it reinforces the hierarchy of power while also challenging Mark's idealistic beliefs about being a hero. While this type of violence might draw criticism from some people, it ultimately serves as an essential storytelling device to add depth, tension, and stakes. But, to counterbalance all of that traumatizing violence, it also helps to incorporate a little bit of satire.
Real eyes, realize, realize. Sit with that one for a minute.
You can't overlook the role satire plays in these two shows. It's used to subvert many of the classic tropes we've become accustomed to, while also highlighting the deeply ironic nature of superheroes. Invincible tends to make these critiques in subtle ways, whereas The Boys takes a much more heavy-handed approach in its commentary.
Her new upcoming single, Chimps Don't Cry, which happens to be true. Unless they're watching left-leaning media, in which case that might bring a tear to their eye.
This series pokes fun at, well, just about everything. Celebrities, politics, consumerism, nothing is off limits. Yet, despite how over-the-top and absurd this show is, it's honestly a little scary how accurate it can be at times. Actors, athletes, and politicians are notoriously known for getting away with terrible things simply due to their power and influence. So why not model the heroes off of them? Most superhero stories emphasize the importance of using power responsibly, yet these heroes show us what negligence looks like on a grand scale. In Superman Returns, we see Superman safely land a plane in a baseball field. This is an iconic scene that showcases how power can be used for the good of humanity. In The Boys, this situation gets flipped on its head. Homelander's carelessness jeopardizes the rescue plan, and because he values his image above everything else, he lets the plane and all of its passengers crash into the ocean. Almost all of the heroes in this show are apathetic about how their actions affect others. They're treated like gods in the media when they're essentially villains behind closed doors. It doesn't really get more on the nose than a character like Stormfront, who fronts as a virtuous social justice warrior, but is secretly a literal Nazi. Through this satire, the show explores the deeply corrupt nature of figures in power. Vought also serves as a stand-in for the mega corporations that keep these kinds of people in power. It's nice to think companies like Stark Industries and Wayne Enterprises would be virtuous and benevolent, but the unfortunate reality is that they'd probably be more like Vought.
The photos circulating of flying sheep, allegedly on Compound V, are clearly fake and generated by AI.
While the satire in Invincible isn't always as obvious as The Boys, it's used just as effectively. This show strikes a delicate balance between poking fun at classic tropes while simultaneously embracing them. The title card is an obvious example, showing up almost every time someone says the word. I think this is a subtle jab at the opening scene in Avengers, which does the same thing. Yet that's not just what it is. Throughout each season, this card becomes more bloodied and weathered, directly reflecting the events of the story. At first, it feels kind of like a gimmick, but it quickly becomes a dynamic element within every episode. Same goes for the post-credit scenes, which don't always show up at the end. I mean, in Season 2 they literally broke the record for the longest post-credit scene ever, because it basically happens halfway through the episode. This is without a doubt a nod at the trend that Marvel started, but it also makes fun of the concept, by pushing the limit of what you can even consider a post-credit scene to be. Besides these structural components, a lot of the satire in this show is weaved within the writing. Some of it isn't as subtle, like the Spider-Man parody or the direct reference to Batman. Yet, these moments help to provide a bit of levity in a story that tends to cover some really dark topics. Despite everything that happens, this story doesn't take itself too seriously, with the creators even being able to poke fun at themselves.
You ever notice that sometimes whoever's speaking has their mouth off camera so you never see their lips moving?
Huh, I didn't notice that.
Yeah, or we'll cut to the back of someone's head while they're talking for the same reason.
While the MCU is no stranger to satire, it's different from how The Boys and Invincible approach it. At least these days it is. Early on, I think satire was used super effectively in the MCU. Yet, over time, the jokes have devolved into cringy nonsense like this.
That's right, there's only one Megan Thee Stallion. Next to mine.
These two shows push satire further than the MCU is able to. The Boys frequently references real events and real people to make the story feel like it takes place in our world, while Invincible takes familiar superhero beats and subverts them in its own unique ways. Now, satire is great and all, but it's usually more effective when combined with a little bit of vulgarity.
Yo, my bad.
It's pretty clear that both of these shows can be vulgar at times. But what do I really mean by this? There's definitely no shortage of profanity in The Boys, albeit most of that comes from Butcher.
Pardon my French, those fuckers.
But this goes beyond just language. These shows tackle tons of adult topics and force us to watch some straight up uncomfortable scenes play out. The writers fully embrace societal taboos and explore topics that just aren't touched on in other superhero stories, at least most of the time.
I will be reinstituting prima nocta.
The world of The Boys is, well, gross. Pretty much every episode has at least one scene that's disturbing, disgusting, or a mix of both. Homelander talking dirty to Homelander, the Deep having to eat Timothy the Octopus, and that one scene in the first episode of Season 3 that I really can't show you at all because of how explicit it is. This show takes full advantage of its mature rating, which really drives home the raw, unfiltered nature of this story. This is also reflected in the show's color grading, with a heavy emphasis on shades of blue and green. This contributes to the overall cold and sick feeling of the world. It also directly contrasts the warm and vibrant color grading used in the fictional, idealistic Vought films.
Cut! Holy we're not gonna beat that. That was perfect. We're going again!
While Invincible isn't always as explicit as The Boys, it still leaves viewers with plenty of unpleasant moments to experience. Most of these are directly tied to violence, with several characters going out in pretty horrific ways if you think about it. Yet there are also zombified cyborgs, parasitic mind-controlling aliens, and a handful of deformed characters that would look absolutely disgusting if they were in live action. Much of what I just mentioned can be found in other superhero stories, yet Invincible finds ways to make these things more unsettling. Behind the vibrant animated visuals, this series can quickly shift into something straight out of a horror film. Not to mention, it forces us to ponder uncomfortable hypotheticals like what it must feel like to die and be reborn multiple times, as well as questioning the moral implications of cloning.
Any questions?
Yeah, a few. First, why me? And second, why a kid version of me? That's just weird.
These two shows push the envelope in their own ways, highlighting aspects of the world that other superhero stories can't even hint at most of the time. This helps drive viewer engagement because it's clear nothing is ever truly off the table in either of these stories. This is also why I think Deadpool 3 is the first MCU film in a long time that people are even remotely excited for. The Deadpool films fall much more in line with The Boys and Invincible than they do with anything Marvel has put out over the last decade. People are tired of recycled tropes and clean-cut stories. They want to see a world that feels a little closer to the one we're living in. Something rough around the edges. The Boys does this by conjuring up some of the most diabolical and disgusting situations imaginable, while Invincible emphasizes the horrors of what these familiar superhero scenarios might actually imply. Both of these approaches lead to an unabashed level of authenticity, and as a result, we get a greater sense of genuine humanity.
I have to learn how to control myself. It's the most important thing I can do. I have to get better. I have to be better.
Through a combination of violence, satire, and vulgarity, these two shows effectively capture what it's like to be human. Of course, this is also heavily dependent on good writing and the ability to leverage these story devices into something more than just mature content for the sake of it. As a viewer, you're forced to experience everything, whether it be horrific, ironic, or disturbing. Every aspect of humanity is put on full display, even when it's not very glamorous. And it's through this candidness that many of the characters become nuanced and three-dimensional, even the worst ones.
What happens if, I don't know, I do this? And now you're just another useless fucking blind guy.
Homelander is easily the most egregious character in The Boys, yet he's given so much backstory that it's not surprising why he is the way he is. He was raised in a lab and treated like a commodity his entire life, with no bearing on love because he's never truly experienced it. So despite all of the terrible things he does, it's hard not to feel bad for him in scenes like this.
Why? But why am I not good enough for you?
It also doesn't help that Butcher completely blurs the line between good and bad. There are countless examples of Butcher doing things just as morally reprehensible as Homelander, with the justification that it's all for the greater good. Butcher and Homelander are essentially two sides of the same coin, which is why you shouldn't idolize either of them. You shouldn't really idolize anyone in this show. There aren't any true heroes in the typical sense. Certain characters are more altruistic than others, but we see the flaws in each of them. Someone like Starlight isn't entirely good, while someone like A-Train isn't entirely bad. This is what makes A-Train's redemption arc from Season 1 to Season 4 actually work.
When I carried your ass to the ER, there was a kid there. His eyes were like, holy shit. Looking at me like I was a hero. That felt better than anything that I had ever done at Vought. Because for once, I didn't hate myself.
Invincible sends a similar message with Omniman's redemption in Season 2. Immediately following the horrific rampage at the end of Season 1, we see how lost and alone Omniman feels afterwards, with him even stopping to save some aliens. Through these humanizing moments, it becomes clear that he might not be as evil as he once seemed. Despite being an Imperial alien, Omniman begins to feel like a human because of the beliefs Mark instilled in him. Mark is, without a doubt, the most idealistic character in either of these two shows. He tries to be a hero in the classical sense, saving every life possible, no matter how irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. Yet, Season 2 has Mark pushed past his limit, and we see that even he is capable of falling to Omniman's level. In many other universes, Mark eventually turns evil, despite his nearly invincible dedication to do the right thing. This just goes to show that the distinction between good and bad really is unclear. Heroes can do terrible things, and terrible people can be heroes.
Did you see? Oh, that was amazing!
Yeah, I saw.
While Superman was a character originally created to represent the ideal man, times have changed and stories have evolved. A lot of people these days are jaded, and they find it hard to believe in a truly self-sacrificing figure like Superman. To give credit where credit is due, I think Zack Snyder was attempting to tackle this dilemma in his vision for the DCEU. His goal was not to copy Marvel move for move, but instead to create a series of films that all evaluate these heroes under a microscope. The Boys and Invincible share this same goal. These shows aim to thoroughly question the concepts of heroes and idols. While it's comforting to imagine a hero as stoic as Superman, or as relentless as Captain America, in reality, they'd probably be as disturbed as Homelander or as deranged as Omniman. Now, I'm not claiming one perspective is better than the other. I think both offer some level of value that can translate to real life. While you can envision someone with power as being entirely altruistic, it's also good to acknowledge that they might not always be. If you were given incredible power and influence, it's easy to say you would use it for good. But all too often, power has a corrupting effect, and these stories remind us of this truth. Despite essentially being gods, these characters are flawed. They can be corrupted, and most importantly, they're human. Even the robots and aliens. Again, this isn't something we've never seen before. There are plenty of great stories in the comic book genre that have made similar arguments. Yet, a trend among all of them is that they take the superhuman and embrace the human. To put it as simply as possible, these stories represent the reality of heroes. Hold on. This is just the beginning of the conversation, though. What do you think it is that makes these two shows so special? And do you even like them? Do you think I hit on some solid points here, or do you think I totally missed the mark? Let me know down below. If you're still here for some reason, thanks for watching. It's been a minute since my last upload. Okay, maybe more than a minute. That was due to a couple of different factors, but this video was definitely getting me back on track. So yeah.
I'm thinking I'm back!
I also want to give a long overdue thank you to everyone who's subscribed and has helped me pass the 10,000 subscriber mark. Trust me, I have a lot more exciting ideas planned for this year, so stay tuned.
It's about time.
If you're not a subscriber, but you like the video and you're interested in seeing what I do next, hey, maybe consider subscribing. Gotta keep those investors happy, you know? Anyway, that's about it for me. I hope you enjoyed, and have a good one.